listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. You might have been a bit freaked out recently if you heard the news that China sent 3 warships to the coast of Sydney and that they were firing missiles in the area. What on earth were they doing there?
The reason is that China, the government of Xi Jinping in particular, the president, wants to make Australia feel vulnerable. That's what this is about. It's been a long time in the works and now it's here.
Bension Siebert breaks down what this all means and if we should be scared of an escalation of conflict in our part of the world in the second half of this episode. But first, as always, we get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. Today's Tuesday, the 25th of February.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Rumours continue to swell that we're on the cusp of an election announcement. Yes, we're still hooking it, as Anthony Albanese sat down for a wide-ranging town hall session on the ABC's Q&A last night. The Prime Minister was quizzed by the audience on a bunch of topics, and to be honest, there was nothing groundbreaking. But let's have a listen to what he had to say on a couple of things. Of course, he was asked about Medicare, one audience member wondering why it had taken Labor this long to provide an $8.5 billion commitment to get more GPs bulk billing. An excellent question, if I do say so myself. After a long-winded answer blaming Peter Dutton for the issues with Medicare from when he was Health Minister, the PM was pushed again.
What we've done is improved the Medicare rebate in each and every year that we've been in government. We tripled that bulk billing incentive. Now, before yesterday, that was the biggest additional funding to Medicare since Medicare was created by the Hawke government.
Yeah, so he didn't really address the timing question. He just said, we were already doing plenty and now we're just doing a little bit more. Albanese was also quizzed on his stance on anti-Semitism, which is another issue that the coalition is really keen to make stand out this election. A Jewish woman in the crowd was asking why it's taken him so long to speak out against it.
We've suffered because nothing was done. If you had have done something then, it would stop there.
I'll just let the Prime Minister respond.
I understand. The Sunday morning after the October 7 terrorist attacks, we unequivocally condemn them. And I have called out anti-Semitism and racism my whole life. It's part of what has defined my involvement in politics.
The Prime Minister was also inevitably asked about Donald Trump and said he refuses to give a running commentary on everything the president says. But when asked if the US would still defend us in the event we were attacked, he was sure the alliance continues to stand firm.
We have an ANZUS agreement and an alliance with the United States.
And you think that's rock solid?
Yes.
Nothing's made you question it?
Nope.
Oh, I love Patricia Karvelas, I really do. He was pushed finally to score his leadership out of 10, but wouldn't do that. However, Albo gave his big pitch to voters, and this is what we can expect him to try to sell us on over the election campaign.
Why do we deserve another term? Because when we came into government, inflation had a 6 in front of it. Now it's got a 2 in front of it. We've created 1.15 million jobs. Real wages have increased 5 quarters in a row, and they're getting to keep more of what they earn because we delivered a tax cut for every taxpayer. Interest rates were rising when we came to office. Now they're falling.
So that was the first half of his answer. And what you'll notice is that it focuses very heavily on one thing, and that is cost of living, because he knows that that is where the election is going to be fought and won this year. He did also touch on women's issues, trotting out universal childcare, the gender pay gap and women's equality more broadly, as well as claiming his government had delivered action on climate change and improved Australia's standing on the world stage and restored the trade relationship with China. But those points he made, inflation, interest rates, real wages, jobs, they are the ones, and the tax cuts, they are the ones that he's going to say, this is what my government has done on cost of living and we're going to do more. That's his big sell. So you said at the top, Chris, on the cusp of an election, when will it be called? Well, our boss yesterday, hey Jess, said this week. So let's go with that. We're going to go with what Jess Wukianov, the EP of The Briefing, thinks of when the election's going to be called. She says this week. And just quickly, I want to point something out that we're seeing the PM do now. So what you might have noticed is he's been doing kind of colour interviews or lifestyle interviews. So he sat down with Abby Chatfield on It's a Lot. Have a listen, really interesting chat. And she's a friend of the show and a fellow podcast here at Listener. I really enjoyed her chat with the PM. And he also did like a magazine Q&A with Jodie Hayden, his partner, and talked about the wedding, really soft and lovely. And
lovely pictures.
Oh, beautiful pictures. But, you know, trying to play that, hey, I'm just a guy.
Yeah.
But this is the first foray into proper news interviews. Now, this was the town hall style thing, but you might notice now that as we get closer to this election and as the campaign starts, this is when he's going to be doing the serious hard news interviews.
New rules will see phone calls made by victims of domestic, family or sexual violence to support services hidden on invoices and bills. The Australian Communications and Media Authority has announced the move as part of a set of proposals that will see telco services become safer, more secure and reliable for those who are experiencing violence at home. Victims would also not be required to repeat their experiences or provide extensive evidence of abuse to their phone providers before receiving assistance.
The ACMA says it's developed the enforceable standards following discussions with relevant consumer advocacy groups, industry and government, and this was a direct response to a direction by the Communications Minister Michelle Rowland in December last year. It says the new rules will fill the gaps in existing regulations that has made them unenforceable and in the past has let vulnerable people down. So this is the idea that, if someone is experiencing domestic violence or family violence at home, something like their phone bill might be checked and might be looked at. And if you're seeing, 1-800-RESPECT come up, well, then that poses questions and it makes it very uncomfortable and potentially dangerous for that victim. So that is what the ACMA is trying to achieve with these regulations, which is, any step forward that we can take when it comes to tackling domestic violence should be looked at as a positive.
Do you want to be an actor? Let's get your foot inside the door.
And the last major awards before the Oscars wrapped up yesterday with papal thriller Conclave taking out the top gong.
The Pope is dead. The throne is vacant.
The conclave begins now. We're about to choose the most famous man in the world.
The Screen Actors Guild Awards, hosted this year by Kristen Bell, who you heard at the top of this headline, are closely watched as an indicator of who and what will do well at the Oscars. This year, Demi Moore continued her winning streak for the gruesome horror The Substance, taking out Best Female Lead, while Zoe Saldana won the Best Supporting Actress for her role in Emilia Perez, which is that bonkers musical thriller that keeps outperforming Wicked.
Men to woman, or woman to men.
Man to woman.
From penis to vagina.
Yeah, I stand by what I said. That is a bonkers musical thriller. And an honourable mention to Kylie Jenner's man or boy, Timothée Chalamet. He took out Best Male Actor for his performance of Bob Dylan in the musical biopic A Complete Unknown.
I know the classiest thing would be to downplay the effort that went into this role and how much this means to me, but the truth is this was 5.5 years of my life. I poured everything I had into playing this incomparable artist, Mr. Bob Dylan, a true American hero, and it was the honor of a lifetime playing him.
In the television categories, it was the usual suspects. So Shogun picked up a few gongs, Baby Reindeer's Jessica Gunning won Best Female Actor, and Martin Short took out Best Actor in a comedy for Only Murders in the Building. Another really big moment was Jane Fonda. She earned herself a standing ovation after accepting her Lifetime Achievement Award.
We get to open people's minds to new ideas, take them beyond what they understand of the world, and help them laugh when things are tough. Make no mistake, empathy is not weak or woke. And by the way, woke just means you give a damn about other people.
And if you can't guess what she was poking at, she was poking at Donald Trump there. So you said it at the top, Chris, the SAG Awards are closely watched as kind of an Oscars preview. We get an idea maybe of who might win. The last 3 Best Ensemble winners, that's the big award, which Conclave won this year. Oppenheimer, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and Coda, they all went on to win Best Picture at the Oscars. So Conclave continuing to get Oscars buzz. And we did actually deep dive the topic that Conclave explores, which is essentially how a new pope is chosen in the event of the death of another one. We did that on yesterday's episode. Make sure you have a listen. It's just one episode back in the rundown. Chris, thank you. Next up, we are getting into Bension's deep dive, looking into why Chinese warships were spotted off the coast of Sydney recently.
Now to that breaking news, and commercial planes flying across the Tasman Sea have been forced to divert around the airspace above 3 Chinese warships.
The Australian Defence Force says they are closely monitoring the 3 military ships that are moving steadily down the east coast in recent days.
We believe it would be appropriate to have been given more warning.
China instead made a direct radio broadcast to aircraft above, sending them scrambling. Flight tracking shows QF121 suddenly turning an hour into its trip to New Zealand.
Hey, Bension here. Trying to imagine just what it would have been like for the pilot on that flight, receiving a radio call direct from a Chinese warship to say, change course right now. China's decision to send 3 warships to perform live fire military drills around 150 nautical miles off the coast of Sydney has understandably freaked a lot of people the hell out over the past few days. The Australian government says these warships were in international waters and that China was within its rights to conduct military exercises there, but China failed to give us notice that this was happening, which is apparently standard practice, and our defence forces, along with New Zealand's, were actively monitoring these ships. China accused Australia of hyping up the incident and claimed to have done nothing illegal. So what does this all mean? Is it all being blown out of proportion? Or should we be genuinely worried about war with China? And how prepared are we if we should? Peter Hartcher is international and political editor at the Sydney Morning Herald and a visiting fellow at the Lowy Institute. Peter, welcome to the briefing. Why did China send these warships?
Excellent question. And half of Australia's running around with it like a chook with its head off trying to find the answer. Because, 10,000 kilometres is a long way to come just to conduct live fire drills that you could conduct much closer to home. The reason is that China, the government of Xi Jinping in particular, the president, wants to make Australia feel vulnerable. That's what this is about. It's been a long time in the works, and now it's here.
Why does China want to make us feel vulnerable?
It's part of a larger pattern where the Chinese government has been using its military to make dozens of countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, feel vulnerable. We are now getting what the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese, the Malaysians have been getting for years. It's an incremental increase in military pressure to do 2 things. First, to create the impression of inevitability that China will be dominant and everybody else needs to fall back in awe and allow it to do as it pleases, not to interfere, not to come near its coastline, not to try to defy it or stand up to it in any way. And second, the larger ultimate goal is to push the US and its allies well away from the Chinese coast, well away from the Asian mainland, and right back into the Pacific Ocean to give the Chinese military complete freedom of control over the coastal littoral. And that's a bit of a problem because it happens to be the world's busiest commercial shipping lane, happens to be where Australia sends most of its exports and gets many of its imports. It happens to be a pretty important lifeline, and the Chinese government wants to be able to put its foot on the neck of us and everybody else if it suits.
It's been reported that commercial airplanes had to be diverted for this purpose. What would it have been like for the passengers on those airplanes?
I don't know that they would have been told. The diversion would have been imperceptible to airline passengers. The journey would have been a little longer, but not overly so. So unless the pilot decided to tell the passengers, they wouldn't know. And maybe that's best, because if you say, ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to make a bit of a diversion around the Chinese Navy task group that's firing live missiles, You might give some of your passengers the jitters, so I suspect they weren't told.
The jitters is right. Is what China has done here legal?
Yes, it is. It's unusual, but it is entirely legal. And part of the point that the Chinese Navy is making here is that you guys, Australia, you operate north of your country, you operate through the Taiwan Straits, you operate through the South China Sea, you operate in areas that we are now claiming as our territorial waters all the time. And we want you to know what it feels like when we come to your coastline and do the same thing to your country. And it's of a piece, really, Bension, with the series of dangerous and reckless military encounters that the Chinese military forces have been engendering, really, have been manufacturing with Australia for the last year and a half. There have been 3 now in 18 months, the latest of which was just 2 weeks ago.
It's very easy to be freaked out by this situation, certainly watching the footage and hearing from the Prime Minister about it. But is us getting really scared about this situation, a bit of fear-mongering, is this what China is hoping to achieve with the Australian public?
It's precisely what the Chinese military is hoping to achieve. It's an exercise in intimidation, and therefore you want your target audience, which is you, me, the rest of us, to be intimidated. They want us to be fearful. So if we are, we're giving them what they want. It's the country's job not to be scared, any more than we were, by the way, any more than we were intimidated than when they imposed more than $20 billion of political trade bans on Australian exports, as you very well know. You know, beef, barley, lobster, wine, and so on. A couple of years ago, Australia completely ignored the pressure and the demands that went with it, and obviously withstood it without any trouble. So this is the next level. They were prepared to use trade sanctions against Australia. It failed. So now we get the military intimidation. And this is just the beginning, Bension. We can expect this to become a regular event. Let me just use briefly the example of Japan as the precedent. Over the last decade, the Chinese Navy has been gradually ramping up the pressure against Japan to the point where right now, today, every day, on average, the Japanese Navy and Air Force has to scramble an average of just under 2 times every day to intercept incoming Chinese military, either jets or ships. They're an early forerunner of what everyone else in the region ultimately can expect.
China, for its part, says that this has been blown well out of proportion. They say Australia has, quote, hyped up the meaning of this naval exercise. How serious is this really?
Well, what you've mentioned, they're pushing back and belittling and mocking and criticising the Australian response is a part of the whole pattern. They use not just the military presence to intimidate, but then when we complain about it, they use that as a way of extending the argument and continuing it then, as you've just mentioned. So this incident in itself is the beginning of a warning about Australia's conduct, China's intentions. Look, we've really not taken seriously all of the aggressive moves that the Chinese military forces have been making in the last decade right around the region. I mentioned the Japanese, there's the Filipino, even the Americans. The Americans said last year that the Chinese Air Force had encountered it in more than 200 dangerous and unprofessional mid-air encounters. That's just the Air Force, regardless of the Navy, over the course of a couple of years. Now, the whole point of this, Bension, is to create the impression of inevitability. We're just going to keep ramping up, and ultimately we're going to dominate. And you guys just have to back off and leave it to us. Forget patrolling, forget your territorial zone. This all belongs to us. But the thing about it is the recklessness in some of the tactics that they use very deliberately. So 2 weeks ago, the Chinese Air Force jet fired live flares 30 metres from an Australian aerial surveillance patrol craft. It could easily result in a crash or death. And they do this similarly with other navies and air forces all the time. And they take that extra risk to back us and everybody else off. That's the point. We're prepared to take a risk, is their message to us. Are you guys? Are you feeling lucky? It's a long-term intimidation tactic. They're not going to start firing missiles at us next week, next year. What will they do? We don't know. When will one of these dangerous encounters result in the death of an Australian or a Japanese or American or whomever? And what do we do then, Bension? Do we call the Americans? Because the fleet that the Chinese have got off where it is at the moment, off the Tasmanian coast, is less than 1% of its navy. Less than 1%. They've got more than 400 naval vessels, the biggest in the world, much bigger than the Americans now. We've got 16. So what do? We call the Americans? Well, what's Donald Trump going to say? Can anybody be sure that the US will assist us? Look at the way he's currently treating US allies in Europe and elsewhere. We're vulnerable. The Chinese military wants to make sure we feel vulnerable.
You mentioned the word warning there. Is the ultimate warning that we could at some point go to war with China?
Yes, that's absolutely the meaning of sending military assets into the waters near another country and manufacturing, as I say, these dangerous encounters at sea or in the air. And the 3 in the last 18 months that Australia has been involved in, I suspect, well, based on the pattern of how the Chinese use their military assets, is just the beginning.
You said not next week, not next year, but what kind of timeline are we talking about realistic war with China? Is that something that could happen in the next 5 years, next 10?
Well, they haven't issued a public timetable, but here's a couple of pointers. One is that Xi Jinping has said he wants his country's military, what he calls modernisation, to be complete by 2027. So that's one timeline. And he's talked about the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. And he said that he wants China to be, quote, at the centre of world affairs by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party taking control of China. So that's sort of the big picture. But the smaller picture, the more immediate picture is this. If push comes to shove, if one of these incidents turns into a death or a firing, do we fire back? Do the Americans fire back? Do the Japanese fire back? Does that turn into an incident? Does that turn into a war or not? This could happen at any point, and that's what the Chinese want us to feel.
Not too long ago, we were celebrating the dropping of Chinese tariffs on Australian exports, as you mentioned. What does the fact that China's done this now say about our relationship with that country?
Well, first of all, it makes a bit of a mockery of the Australian government's position. The Australian government tells us that they have stabilised the relationship with China. Well, it doesn't look very stable now, does it? And I've said in the past that trying to stabilise the relationship with another country, which is determined on overturning the status quo in our region and asserting itself as the dominant power, that's not a stable bet. And I've said in the past that it's like standing on top of a volcano and saying, well, we've established stability. It's just a matter of time before it erupts. So the existing policy the stated policy is obviously pretty threadbare at the moment. And I'd quote Kevin Rudd to you. Rudd is obviously our ambassador to the US at the moment, but he's also one of the world's leading experts on Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. He says the technique, the policy that they're using on Australia is pressure and release. Apply pressure and then pretend that you're going through some great concession and doing you a favour by releasing the pressure. And when I said to him, so are we currently experiencing pressure or release? He said both at the same time.
What does this look like politically for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, just heading into a federal election?
Well, it makes it awkward for him. The guy who's spent the last couple of years saying we're stabilising the relationship with China. I've met Xi Jinping, everything's smooth, the tariffs, the trade bans are gone. It makes him look a bit foolish. That's the first thing. The second thing is the opposition is trying to politicise it, obviously, saying, oh, you're too weak, you should be doing more, without actually suggesting what he should be doing, because in truth, there isn't anything more that he could or should do. The current fleet disposal, the task force off the coast, isn't breaking international law and it's within its rights. So what are we supposed to do? Dutton's not making any suggestions. He's simply trying to shine a light on it to make Albanese feel uncomfortable. The truth is, we should all feel uncomfortable because we've wasted a lot of years failing to take all the warnings and build sufficient military strength so that we're first able to defy international pressure from, let's say, just now China, and second, so that we can do it independently of the US. We've done neither, and so now we're a bit stuck.
Well, that's a grim note to end on. Peter Hartcher, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
It's a pleasure, Bension. Sometimes reality is grim, I'm sorry.
I'm afraid so. Peter Hartcher there. He's the Sydney Morning Herald's international and political editor. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share this ep with someone who might want to know why Chinese warships are sailing off our coast. And for exclusive video content, check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.